Are we all set? All right. We're new tonight, although it's an online thing that some of you might notice. Those of you who are here, it should just be as normal. So, cutting out a little bit, is that normal? I know there's some other microphones that are very staticky and we're not using those, but all right, we'll cross our fingers. Okay, thank you. I'll just keep talking. Once I start, and then it gets to be 8:05, and then I go, oh, I better stop talking. So we'll just go. Tonight, sports space in St. Anthony Park, here and near St. Anthony Park, as you'll see. Here we're over at the fairgrounds, obviously, for a little bit of harness racing and looking back towards the St. Paul campus as it looked relatively early on. Last time I had a little self-portrait at the start, so I thought, oh, I can find a sports self-portrait. So here's the new title, and I actually will come back to this at the very end of the presentation because it's hard to believe, but they are connected. So this is just before US Bank Stadium opened, and I was a tour guide there for about a year, and I think we had a training session or something, and so I rode over and took some pictures early on. So watch for it. We're going to zoom in. I am there with the white bike helmet, the safety green vest, and the bicycle. See it? So where is the remote control this afternoon? Oh, there it is. There. So if we go back, now you can maybe see it, right? Of course. There's Kristen. Sure. All right, so there we are. That's tonight's self-portrait. I will be challenged to be able to do a self-portrait for the railroad island. And do you see something? I unplugged a couple of things, but it was all power and not microphones. We'll make it work. We'll make it work. Okay. Just be careful back there. Okay, a month from tonight, we are going to attempt to return to the Railroad Island presentation. Not the St. Paul neighborhood called Railroad Island that's over on the east side, but our very own St. Anthony Park Railroad Island, the section of land between the Great Northern Tracks and the Northern Pacific Tracks. It was kind of the original settlement. The first store was there. There were a few houses. Everett Court is in that area. It's one of the few little enclaves that's left. Well, this was a little enclave altogether, but this was the presentation scheduled in November, but my mom fell that day, and so I canceled the presentation. So here it is, coming back into the rotation, we hope. April is Allie's, easy to remember, alliteration. May, no alliteration whatsoever. We're going to look at the Virginia Investors Group, who got the north part of St. Anthony Park going. I'm starting to think about walking tours. Let's just do a little in-house poll here. Anybody interested in walking tours this summer? Okay, it'll be worth doing walking tours. So I'll come up with something. Will be an alley session. We did alleys in the northeast section of the neighborhood, and people seem to enjoy it. And of course, when you're walking, you can't cover as much territory as you can with slides. So I'll choose a different section of the neighborhood that has some interesting alleys, and then we'll do a walking tour there, and one or two other things. We'll see. All right, the usual things. Here is the link for the tip jar for those of you online. For those of you in the tip jar is sitting at the back by the door, and Venmo and Zelle and all of that is there. Also at kristenanderson.org, in this case, /SAP maps. This is the set of links to maps. I found a new one quite by accident, and it is J. Rice's map of Ramsey County, first published in 1874, reissued in 1879 by one of the local realtors. And there's a copy at the Public Library, a copy at the New York Public Library Digital Collections. So there's a link to that there. So if you're a map geek, have fun. Last time we were meeting just as this congregation was starting to collect food for a Spanish-speaking Lutheran congregation in the northern suburbs. And this is what things looked like the afternoon of the presentation. So I'll just have you note please. This bag with the green and the red, and that bag right there, also where the stairs end in relationship to the slide. So this is how it started, and this is how it was going. So here we've got the white plastic bag, and here's the green and red bag, and the bottom of the stairs, and all of this. And this was the smaller section, because going off towards your right in the slide and on into the fellowship hall, there were lots and lots and lots more things. We are working with a kind of reconfiguration of this group right now, but they've changed how they're collecting things, asking for things. Andy's out looking for a microphone, so I hope that helps. But there is just general food shelf collection. So if you are anxious to do something and you don't have some other group that you're committed to, or you're just looking for, oh, I didn't do something this week, I can bring some food over here, you're welcome to drop things off here anytime. In fact, as the weather changes, don't forget there is and has been for a long time a pantry sitting out at Como and Luther Place. And the only thing about that to keep in mind what's in there, that what's in there is based on, well, you can put anything in there that you want, but things will freeze. So just make some careful choices. Andy, are you looking for a microphone? Choices and selections. All right, sports. Have you ever seen the Key and Peele Magic School video? It came from Comedy Central. You'll have to look it up. Have you ever seen Substitute Teacher, where the guy mispronounces names? Yeah. Key and Peele, look it up. Instead of saying Aaron, he says Aaron. And instead of saying Blake, he calls the kid Balake. Anyhow, there's another one where they have a magic school that they claim is highly ranked as Hogwarts, or very close. And there's one little line in there where one of the guys says, sports. Everybody loves sports. And the other one says, not everybody. But you'll see, I hope that we all have some connections that are kind of established through to sports, and here, perhaps a microphone solution. We'll see. All right, we're going to be going today from these guys, some mites associated with Langford, as you can tell, to these guys, or almost these guys. They might have been in or very close to the neighborhood, but for a few decisions and some other spaces that got into the mix. But we'll end up with the Vikings as we move along. Here we're at the Gibbs School, which sat at the site of Bell Museum. As a matter of fact, that's the easiest way to explain it. Larpenteur is here in front, between you and, or right behind you, if you're the photographer. Cleveland is running here along the left side of the image. And this little school was quite old. It had an addition put on the front. That one seems to be working. It was unfortunately torn down by the U. Okay, big moment. We'll see if this is better. Thank you for doing this and at least trying. We'll hope for the best. Its last use, I think, was for Christmas trees. Dave, does that sound right? I know they sold Christmas trees here, and I'm not sure that they did anything else with the building. Typically, when they mothball a space, they don't always mothball it, they store things in it. And the excuse that they gave for getting rid of it, as I recall, is that it was full of lead paint. There was no way they could restore it and all that sort of thing. But there it is, the Gibbs School. It was used into the 1960s, I think. Maybe last for kindergartners who were in the Grove. I think that was what happened. And then the kids were eventually transferred to other schools. But it's evidently recess time, and there are kids outside playing. And if you've been around kids at all, I suppose I could say if you've been around dogs at all, you know that they have to go out. A lot of energy, they have to exercise, healthy mind, healthy body, all of those kinds of things. And so play is important, and in the case of the playground equipment, unstructured play is important. We see that this, sometimes just because the kids will do it themselves, turns into organized activities. So I know along Doswell, Joe Schuster used to arrange Kick the Can. I don't know if you were ever involved in any of those. There were these evening games. There were no adults. It was just like, let's play this. Here are the rules. On this block, when the old Strickler Mansion sat just to the east of where we are right now, there was a low space behind that building that I think had a tennis court in it originally when it was a rich person's house. And then we used it for all kinds of games. And again, no one was telling us the rules or which games we had to play. So there's that kind of freedom which comes up. And then there's all the negotiation that goes place. Lots of important things that kids learn from this. And so we'll see, starting with schools, associations with sport and recreation activities, and we'll move to other kinds of settings, sometimes overlapping where these things occurred. Here's another good example of that. This is just across the street from St. Anthony, well, when there was a street. Okay, it's right across from St. Anthony Park Elementary. You can see the Methodist Church just up there at the top of the slide in the center. And there's an adult watching, and there's some kids playing, and they are playing, if you haven't picked it out yet, football. See the football up in the air? So that they haven't agreed on where the boundaries are and where the goalposts are. They're just throwing a football around, but they're engaging in this important physical activity and all the kinds of lessons. Again, teamwork, competition is fun for some people. So there are lots and lots of opportunities for children to engage. And the design of schools, the programming in schools, all meant to encourage that sort of thing. And it happened certainly through elementary school with some of the kinds of things that happened in gym class, for instance. High school as well. When I was in college, I was required to take 2 sports. And in a very strange kind of way, I chose fencing and horseback riding. And I haven't fenced since then. And I sort of watch when there are movies and there's fencing going on. But at Augsburg, they call them lifetime sports. And one that's been on the books for decades is pickleball. And it was the biggest joke ever. Like, pickleball. There was nothing left, and I signed up for pickleball. And now I'm sure all those people who signed up for pickleball in the 1980s and 90s are saying, yeah, I know this game. I played pickleball in college. Gutterson School. Towards the end, and actually as they doubled the size of the school, as they brought in portables, they were running out of space over and over and over again, and the building was older and older. And you can see here that in order to have gym class, 2 students at a time, students first have to carry the mat to the upstairs hall. So evidently the lesson for the day is headstands. And there's this whole line of kids waiting for their turn to do headstands. Not optimum, but they thought it was important enough to figure out a way to do it. Here's one some of you may remember. I always dreaded this. Being an introvert, this is, about the worst thing that can ever happen to you. But square dancing. This is St. Anthony Park Elementary in the original gym. And worse than just square dancing, there are 2 circles of kids, maybe 6th graders in this case. She looks happy, doesn't she? Ooh. So they have an audience. That's even worse. They not only had to square dance, but they had to have an audience. But this was, I think, part of the curriculum. I remember some kind of dancing at Murray, too. Am I imagining that? There was something going on there. And I'm sure it was a wonderful thing with those little gym outfits that we had to wear. Here at St. Cecilia, there was a gym. And Father Doyle, who was the priest back in the 1920s when the school was relatively new, would open the school building so that kids could come in and play in the gym. He had a gym and there were these kids, and he thought that it was the right thing to do. And certainly it was probably good for those kids in lots of different ways. We're at Murray here in the 1930s. This is the original Murray complex, Murray building. So we're at the south end of the parking lot and we're looking kind of north, almost straight north towards Buford. And this is before the auditorium wing was built. And so these boys, I think all boys in this area, playing baseball. And then there look like girls here, I'm just guessing based on clothes, skirts, not pants. I'm not sure what game they're playing up there. But getting outside, maybe there was a gym teacher there, maybe there wasn't. I know at St. Anthony Park, my favorite game was dodgeball. We played it in the gym. We also played it out in Langford Park. And that's when they took the classes outside. It's possible that that's what's happening here, but it's also possible that these kids simply organize themselves into these particular games. Andy, the microphone change is fabulous. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Andy, huh? So it's all about space, right? They ran out of space at Murray, and they added the auditorium wing over here, which took out the little baseball field back there. That's where those guys were. This is the original gym, by the way, that box right there. And then they had this space to work with in front of the school. And if you're new to the neighborhood, like anytime after the 1960s, new to the neighborhood, it's like, what space in front of the school? That's where they built the 1960s building that's sitting there. Grantham Street is at the bottom of the slide, running right to left. Buford is running up the left side of the slide. And then Chelmsford is the street left to right across the top of the slide. So this big area right in here was a place that they had a chance, for instance, to have a rink. And the rink was especially important, not just so that they could practice hockey, but there was another group that practiced on the rink, which was the band, right? The marching band skated. And they were kind of famous for that. I think there's a picture of them performing at the St. Paul Auditorium. Not every marching band learned how to skate. And they did that here because it was close and convenient. They end up getting a field. I read in some report that it was somewhat remote from the school. But if you look around the school building, they didn't have much space to work with. So if you wanted a football field, you needed to go somewhere else. And so the Murrayfield property, here in use by Como Park High School in 2017, when their field was being renovated or worked on, they came over and they used Murrayfield. Murrayfield is used for lots and lots of things. Sometimes I think even by the kids at Murray. I think they actually, those of you who live nearby may see them walking down there once in a while. But its ownership in the property records isn't exactly clear, at least what I can look up at home. The things that belong to the schools say so, and the things that belong to the parks say so, and this is something like tax-exempt municipal property. And from what I've read from some documents in the 1940s, it was something that belonged to the park board, and they were going to develop it as the St. Anthony Park Playground. And they had the assistance of this fairly new at that point, St. Anthony Park Association, which had among its top priorities in the 1940s, places for recreation and exercise and games in the park. So it was a kind of high priority. And so that was, they did some filling and they did some grading to prepare the space for that work, but, and I think it is still used for the school. But if you're around it at all, you maybe know there are individuals who go and run there. In fact, we can look at this. Here's Ed with 2.5 golden retrievers. The black one was mine. She was a golden doodle, so that's the half golden retriever. But there's a track. You can see the football goalposts. You can see soccer nets. It's used for lacrosse. It's used for soccer. It's used by a lot of community groups. And then the end where the dogs were, there was a lot of fetch going on. That was the activity. The humans mostly just stood around and talked. So we exercised our jawbones, but not much else. The dogs were running for balls most of the time. But this end has backstops for baseball, softball, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of community use of the field, and I think probably its claim to fame would be the times that people have gone to some game that they're supposed to be playing and they end up at McMurray Field. How inconvenient is that to have two fields in the northwest corner of the city, Murray Field and McMurray Field, but whatever, here it is, a neighborhood asset. During the Second World War, by the way, the spot where the Health Partners building sits, they had a huge victory garden, community garden in that spot. And on to more schools. Anyone recognize this campus? Yep, it's Breck. So we're on the Luther Seminary so-called lower campus, and in the upper right-hand corner is Stubb Hall, the north end of Stubb Hall. And you can see the hillside didn't have a lot of trees on it at that point. This is a 1954 photograph, I think. And we have another one coming up. The next one is the same guys, just in a different spot. But the trees on that hillside have grown up and were doing so during the 1960s. My brother broke his collarbone sliding on that hill. It was clear enough that you could still slide on it, but not clear enough that you might not run into something. And so he hit a tree and broke his collarbone. But there you can see it's relatively open. So Breck had a fairly large amount of space to work with for their campus. They built a small building kind of mid-block between Fulham and Como along Hendon. And then they built the building that sat, we'll see, might as well look at it now. That building that's on the right-hand side of the slide that had its front on Como, big columns, there was a little tower up at the top. They built Stub, or part of it, next. I think it was called Haupt. One of their leaders was Charles Haupt. They built that little building right there. So the first building is hidden by this. Then this came in the late 1920s. Then Stub in 2 phases. And then that one was fairly close to the time that they were leaving the campus. The big building on the side, their main building, had a big open 2-story area, chapel, auditorium. That's what these huge windows are up here. But down on the lowest level of the building, and partly below ground, I'm sure, a gymnasium. So when Luther Seminary bought the campus, they used the upper section for their chapel, and then the gym was also in use. People would have basketball games in there. Here we have the same football group out and getting ready on their fields. The field is very flat, and you might think, well, how lucky, they bought a piece of property where they could build their buildings on the hillsides, very lovely, and then they had a flat field to work with. Actually, they did not have a flat field to work with. They moved out all kinds of dirt. I'm not sure where it went, but the hills basically continued. You know how the Hendon Hill comes down from Fulham to Como? That's what the slope of the hill was through this whole property, I think. So they moved all kinds of soil around so that they could flatten it and then level things out and pack it in so that it had no problems with drainage. Breck was a famous school because they not only educated boys, they also educated horses at Breck. And you can see the class of 1947 here, just kidding. The horses were part of their program. The stables were back here. We're looking at Eustace along there. So these guys are all facing Como, essentially. And they had a track where they could ride the horses around, and they wore uniforms, but here they're all set up, even with some flags. And they'd march, they would drill. That was part of their educational program. They also played hockey. I showed this picture a while ago. When was it? I think this year, maybe it was last year. Their rink was where the seminary's northwestern building is built. And so this house right here is still standing. This is its side along Hendon. Its front faces Fulham. These 3 houses were on Fulham facing towards the west. This one was torn down. These 2 were moved, and that's where the Olson Campus Center sits. So that, I hope, helps you to see and understand where the Breck hockey rink was located. We don't often associate sports with seminaries, but when they bought the Breck property, they inherited a gym and they had some fields, and so that was all good. But here is Bachman Hall, the first building on the Luther Seminary campus, and first building on many campuses, doesn't matter which institution it is, was called Main, and if it lasted long enough, it was called Old Main, and it was everything for the campus. So residential space, not only for students, but for some faculty. The staff sometimes lived in these buildings. They had classrooms, there were offices, they had dining halls. In this case, they had a big chapel, which was in the wing that's kind of along the right, and that's where this congregation started. This group spent 45 years or more worshiping in Bachman Hall before this building was built. And then in the other wing, towards the left, they had a gym. So this is a 1905 picture of the gym, which looks more like a workout room than a gym. No basketball hoops, but a lot of gymnastics stuff. And evidently things to throw around, because it looks to me as though there's a broken window right there. I might be wrong, but I think that's what I'm looking at. So that was a kind of a standard part of having an institution like this, someplace to eat, sleep, study, and work out. Play some games with your fellow students. Even though the St. Paul campus was not the main campus of the university, not the first to get started, there are still similar kinds of sport and recreation spaces designed right into the campus. So in the northern end of the campus, we get the gym from the 19-teens, designed by Clarence Johnston. And then we have this field, which is in use in lots of different ways. If you walk through, you may see any number of games taking place. I've seen cricket played here, and I've seen cricket being played at Langford. So it's, if you do enough walking around the parks, you're going to see a big range of things. And rather than building over that spot, they left it. It's still a field, a recreational field. Here we're on the lawn. This shot was taken from Cleveland, looking towards Coffee Hall, which was built in 1906. And this is a photograph from about 1915 when they had tennis courts on the lawn. If you look at other photos farther south along the lawn, you'll see that it wasn't lawn. It was kind of dirt and sort of scumbly and weeds and stuff growing up. And this isn't as nicely kept, I guess, in terms of lawn as we expect to see now. But they were already, thanks to Samuel Green, I'm sure, planting a variety of trees around the edges of this space. And this area, before it was a tennis court and before it belonged to the U, was a farm, a 40-acre farm. And all the farm buildings were here on this spot in the corner that's right by Buford and Cleveland. Tennis, by the way, very popular in the 19-teens, which figures into College Park, although we'll see that in just a little while. So schools did their share with spaces for activity, recreation, games, education for those things, for children through high school at least, university as well. The next big player in the development of sports space around the neighborhood are the parks, the city's parks. And this is College Park, and I've chosen it, although I don't think I have exactly the right view of it, but you may know this on your own. I've chosen it because it has all of the characteristics of 19th century parks. So they had some very specific ideas about what parks were for and why they were important and how they could fulfill their important role as being an antidote to the dirty, noisy, busy downtown area. And we still talk about going outside in nature, and you're supposed to see the sun fairly early on in the day, and you should go someplace that is green. That's kind of a challenge for us right now, but if you want a soothing office or bedroom, you're supposed to paint your walls green. So here we have that sense of the view, and part of what they were doing with their parks was to make sure that nature was an important part of someone's experience when they went to the park. And nature might mean that there were trees and there was grass, but lots of different kinds of trees so that you get the variety of colors in the trees in the fall. Terrain, water, all those kinds of things were elements that emphasized nature, and in the 19th century they thought they were very important elements for parks. A second thing that parks were supposed to do was to teach you something, and perhaps what you were learning was something about different kinds of trees. But it was not unusual for the kind of the big high-level parks to have sculpture in them. And in a park like College Park, they substituted or satisfied themselves with boulders that would have plaques on them. And so up in that grove of pine trees, there is a stone marker that commemorates Professor Sam Green, who lived in the neighborhood. He was very active in developing College Park, but he was involved in the Improvement League. And they were the ones who gave trees away to children on Arbor Day, and they worked hard to get a police officer to patrol or to get the sidewalks taken care of, or they stepped in and spoke for the neighborhood. And the group, kind of the grandchild of the Improvement Association, or the Improvement League, which ended, I think, in the 19-teens, early 1920s, that was the St. Anthony Park Association. And so that was the third of these groups that formed themselves in the neighborhood and said, hey, we've got work to do. We could make this better. We should band together. We should assign the person who can lobby with the city to go do that. And so that whole idea about parks, about improving the neighborhood, Sam Green was very involved in it. And there is a memorial stone to him, not his grave, but there's a boulder with a plaque on it that's up there in the middle of the pine trees. There are a couple of others. One of the more recent things that people do is that they'll give a donation for a bench, for instance. There's some of those at the library. And so the idea is that you could go to a park space and you could learn something. So it isn't just, here's a beautiful space, I love the green grass, this is lovely, but that you had a chance to improve yourself, that you could learn something. The third and final thing that they believed was important with parks was recreation. And this gets to be an interesting sticking point, even in the 19th century and certainly into the early 20th century. The issue with recreation is that the people who dreamed up these parks were thinking pretty big. Minnehaha Falls, Como Park. They were thinking about great big places where you might go for a stroll on a Sunday afternoon. Not so much about where you could play rugby on a Sunday afternoon, but the kind of, I'll dress up in my nicest clothes and we'll drive the horse and carriage and then we'll tie them up and we'll go for a stroll. That was recreation. But fairly shortly after that, especially with parks that weren't very big, the idea of recreation was really pushed by children who showed up to play in these spaces. And then there get to be conflicts. So I want to stroll and you want to play baseball and we're occupying the same space. These days, the easiest way for us to understand it is to think about the paved bike lanes. So there's one that starts at Como and Raymond and Cleveland, and it picks up and goes through Como Park, and you can get to Wheelock Parkway, and it's part of the Grand Round system. And it's a big, wide asphalt path. Has anyone been on it? Any walking or biking? They're lovely, and they aren't filled with cracks yet, so that's all good. But one of the things that happens is that someone who's interested in inline skating might see that as a great place to skate, and someone who wants to walk, since there's no sidewalk on the north side of Como by the fairgrounds, pedestrians, inline skaters, people with strollers, they're all doing some kind of recreation, but they're all trying to share the same space, and the uses don't really match. Even people who ride their bikes in a leisurely way as opposed to people who ride their road bikes at 20 miles an hour, or people like me who've graduated to e-bikes, and I can ride my e-bike at 20 miles an hour. Those kinds of conflicts have kind of situated themselves in park space, and that was certainly the case around here. So sometimes they didn't even try. Let me see if I can get that arrow out of there. There, that's better. Here's Hampton Park. Not a good place to set up a football field, a baseball field, any of the field sports, essentially. They wouldn't work here. Not a lot of room for a playground. There's a nice, you can walk, you can sit at the picnic tables, but the size of the park, the shape of the park just didn't lend themselves to that. And so then Father Doyle says, well, the kids can't really play out here. I'm going to let them into the gymnasium at St. Cecilia's. Or eventually there is, in fact, a park that's designated in South St. Anthony Park. We can read a little bit of this at Langford Park. This is an early 20th century photograph that shows Langford Park. We're looking towards, there's Gutterson right there. And here's Charles Gibson's house. He was the photographer here. That house is still there. I think it's 85 Langford. The apartment building that's made of brick and stone sits right here. Knapp is right over there. So you can see in the park, there are walkways. There are plantings near the walkways. There is, in fact, water at this point. Langford was a wetland. I guess that's the nicest way to describe it. Horace Cleveland said it was going to be a lake with a park around it, but it wasn't ever actually a lake. It wasn't deep enough for that, so they tried to dredge it so it would be deeper and it would be a lake, but that didn't work, and then they filled it in because there were problems with insects. And at this stage, they had a kind of a canal that went where the trees are, and there's a bridge right there that goes over the water. And then the water goes back this way. It was lined with clay, and in 1912, when the city put in storm sewers, it drained all the water out of the whole lake situation. So that didn't work. And then they ended up lining it with concrete, and it was up towards the school end. And in the 1950s, when the school went in, the remnants of that went out. But here you can see there's that waterway, there's the lovely little bridge. You could look up and down the water in both directions. The paths curve in some cases. This was recreation of the sort that people my age, when they're not on their e-bikes, might be doing. It's like, I'm going to go for a walk, right? Here's the pond. As a matter of fact, this, I think, is a 1930s picture, and you can see kind of what was left of the pond at that point. And maybe some of the reasons that they didn't want to keep the pond, dangerous, might be one of the things to keep in mind. Langford's big enough that they were able to separate sections. And so the section that's to the south was designated by the mid-1920s as recreation space. And then the water started sort of at the right-hand side of the slide and went up towards the elementary school. And you can see that that decision from the 1920s has lasted now for basically 100 years. When they graded these fields, that was one of the things they needed to do. They realized they had to be level. They also built a little recreation building, which sat just here. And it was replaced in the 1970s by this building. And that's when they closed off Blake, because the street, which used to run through the park, is now covered by the building. Basketball courts, had been tennis, now pickleball. Maybe they're both. Does anybody play down there? Anybody know? Playground, right there where the trees are. So they're looking at a lot of different ages and a lot of different activities and different seasons. You can see the boards are up here for hockey, and you can see inside this one, here's an infield, so 2 infields for diamonds right there. So using them all year in lots of different ways. This photograph is identified as a baseball team from Murray. And it's not the Murray up here. Gutterson was originally called Murray. And when they built the Murray that's right up there in the mid-1920s, they named that Murray. And then they renamed the other school Gutterson after a prominent St. Anthony Park citizen. So if this is in fact a school team, which gets us to the point where we blend school activities and park activities, they would be from before 1925. And I've looked at them a lot, and some of them look pretty tough. These guys. It shouldn't say M for Murray, it should say TT for Totem Town, maybe. Some of you St. Paul folks recognize that joke. Juvenile detention facility over on the east side. They could have put this kid in charge, I think, because he looks tough enough to handle those guys. So you may, if you grew up around here, remember this guy. Anybody remember who he is? Winterhalter, right. This is Lieutenant Winterhalter. He was the St. Paul police officer who was in charge of the school patrol. And so those of us who served in the school patrol were basically in the traffic division. I think this kid was maybe in the homicide division for school patrol. Watching out for these guys. But given the era, one of these guys might have been his grandfather, and maybe that accounts for the tough look that Mr. School Patrol had. Anyhow, there they were, a baseball team, organized. They had matching uniforms. They certainly didn't play at Gutterson because, as I understand, there was no place for a ball field at Gutterson. So they would have used Langford Park, as the kids at St. Anthony Park Elementary did as well. Here's an early picture of the sports and recreation end of Langford with the warming house that many of us would remember. And ice, and people gathered around for some kind of game. Here's the opposite season, warming house again. Take a look at the basic design of this. This is obviously a St. Paul Parks and Recreation plan book design for a parks building, because exactly the same form had showed up in South St. Anthony Park. This is 4th of July stuff. I'm not including it because it's one of those goofy races that they do on the 4th of July, but I'm including it because the building is included in this picture. And here we have one of our celebrities here. Mr. Hansen, who provided the pictures, some of these pictures to me, is also inside this picture. Another Langford Park team, in this case, probably not organized by the schools, but run by Parks and Rec. Although lots of involvement pretty much across the board. I'll try to remember to mention that again in a minute. So I've got a little anecdote to mention here. And I love this because we have obviously moved into the era of the trophy industrial complex, where everybody gets a trophy. I told Paul I tried to get into Murray. I did get into Murray today. I was going to check to see if they had the old trophies from the high school, and they evidently do. But I was there in the middle of the day, and I went with my business card and my driver's license and a copy of the Bugle that said I was giving this talk tonight, just to make sure they'd let me in and, weren't worried about me. And they did let me in, but the principal had to show me around, and he was supervising lunch hour. So I'll go back and maybe I'll take some pictures at Murray of the trophy cases that are evidently still there. So organized teams with their trophies. And here's another kind of organization. This picture was taken on Sunday. And this is a group that I read about in the listserv. They call themselves the Church League. And these are just adults who get together on Sundays between 10 and 11, sometimes Saturdays between 10 and 11. It's one of those kind of casual things. And one of my neighbors across the street is playing. In fact, he's right there in the middle. And I said, hey, Dirk, are you going to play on Sunday? Would you get some pictures for me? And his daughter took some pictures. How nice. There were actually kids playing on the rink just across the way. And to get all this going, as you know, if you're on the listserv, there's a call that comes out saying, we're going to flood the rinks now, and we need people on shifts, and we need you to help out with this. There's a lot of involvement in making these programs run. Dave Hansen, for instance, holding up the great big trophy there in the background. Do you have this in your house, by the way? Did you keep this? I'm just checking. Is that what the coach gets to do? Were you coaching? Yeah, you don't collect stuff. It's maybe in the rec center. Maybe. Who knows where they end up? Because it doesn't really matter where they end up, because the trophy industrial complex will crank out more trophies to replace the ones that get lost wherever they get lost. Here we're looking at a similar sort of building, same size, same arrangement of double doors. This is at South St. Anthony Park. It went in, one estimate I read, in the late 19-teens and was eventually replaced in the 1970s by the building that's there. We'll see it in a minute. Here is a South St. Anthony Park softball team, so organized by Parks and Rec and using the facilities that are there. In this case, you can tell if you look at an aerial view or you look at a map, instead of one of the old-fashioned parks, like, oh, here's a place with curving streets around the edges and we have a little pond and this will be a lovely park. One of the things that cities, not just St. Paul, but Minneapolis as well, and I'm sure others, one of the things that they did is that they really got going on this recreation side of things, and so they would take a city block. They might condemn, if there was a block that was nearly empty, they might condemn the single property that was there, and so they would get these square, sometimes one block square, sometimes a little bit bigger. They'd create parks that were largely for recreation purposes, for fields, and then usually a recreation building. Here's the current building. That's a collaborative effort with Joy of the People, Joy to the People, soccer group, and the City of St. Paul. Up at the top is the drawing for this building. This was an effort by a local resident who just thought it was really, really important to have a decent gym and community building and recreation building. So that's mid-1970s, 1976, and the building as it looks now-ish. Well, not right now, obviously. Leaves and grass, right? Soon, it'll look that way again soon. Smaller parks sometimes got smaller facilities included. So here we're at the Hendon Triangles. At the upper right is Monkey Island, site of a great debacle a few years ago when the city of St. Paul came in and took out the playground equipment. They didn't ask, they didn't announce it, they just went in and took it out, and people were shocked that it was gone. And I think the city was shocked when the neighborhood went wild about how, well, no puns intended, how Monkey Island was taken apart. So new equipment there, redone park space, and on the left, the northern of the two Hendon Triangle parks. So that's Hendon, that's running from top center towards the lower right. Branston here is splitting on either side of the parks, and there's not much of Branston that isn't involved in this whole splitting thing. Up here where I am is Hoyt. So we're very close to the city limits and very close to the Grove. This park, when I was a kid at least, had tennis courts on it. And it's, well, you can see here, perfectly flat. And I'm sure that the giant hill that sort of starts up at the Grove and makes its way down, Muskego is part of it, and then it kind of comes down here into a low section behind where the Luther Place building is. This was part of it, I'm sure, and they took the top off of it so that they could make space for tennis courts. And I wanted to get a picture of it, and lo and behold, there were children there. And they had moved in a net of some sort. I'm not sure if they were doing lacrosse or soccer or summer hockey. I'm not sure what they were doing, but there's a net, and they were using that park space for a game, which was fabulous. Thank you, boys, for setting that up for me. Also, the kind of problematic College Park, lovely nature setting, rolling hills, terrific for sledding this time of year, provided you get some snow on it. But they did very early on put tennis courts up in the area along Raymond. And the placement of the tennis courts, if you stand over here and you look this way, it lines up pretty much with the alley in the back of the houses along here. So the way that the land was platted kind of lent itself to having the tennis courts in that spot. Now there's a playground here by the tennis courts. Many of you will remember the playground used to be over here. And it was certainly great for playing, but the kinds of things that you would do with the monkey bars and all the rest would build physical strength, good for health and wellness and all the rest. And the tennis courts today. Again, not today, but soon. The tennis courts soon. So I started to tell a little story, and then I stopped myself because I knew this was coming up. We have the schools with sports spaces and sports education and sports activity, sports broadly conceived. We have the parks doing many of the same jobs. But then it's not enough. And there is a kind of additional engagement that comes into play. This is from 1948. And it's an ad that's sponsored by the St. Paul Council of Parent-Teacher Associations. And they have a crusade. At the bottom it says, "He who destroys public property robs you. That makes it your problem. Do something about it," with some Trumpish capitalized words all the way through for emphasis. So there's a list of things over on the left of how much it costs with willful damage to street lamps, policing costs due to juvenile vandalism, street lighting labor costs, damage in parks and playgrounds, broken windows in schools, and vandalism in schools, adding up to $52,608.50. The option on the other side is 16 summer playground directors, equipment for 5 school bands, $150 in athletic equipment for each elementary school, 400 library books for each senior high school, skating rinks with supervision for the season, and band concerts and community sings in the summer park program. Adds up to $52,608.50. So it's, which bill would you rather pay, as you can see at the top? Well, in St. Anthony Park, they decided that they definitely wanted to pay the bill on the right-hand side. And that's what the St. Anthony Park Association was very active in doing in the mid-1940s and following. And that activity wasn't just that they had bake sales and raised money here. The activity was that they talked to the parks commissioners, and they lobbied, and they did all kinds of things to leverage as much money as they could to programs that were here. So in 1960, there was a comment about the parks in St. Anthony Park that said that they ranked at the lowest 1/3 in terms of quality of facilities and kind of equipment and that sort of thing, but in the top third in terms of programming, amount, and quality. And that wasn't because they had such good equipment or buildings, it's because the parents and the community stepped in to make sure that that was going to happen. So there's that whole sense of engagement that in some cases bridges the schools with the parks as well. These are some photos from the late 1940s where the St. Anthony Park Association and the PTA, as they called it then, emphasizing how they had stepped in to provide funding for summer programs in the recreation centers. So basically they said, well, there's June, July, and August when the kids are kind of loose and running around, and how about we have some archery classes? How about we have some arts and crafts programs? And so this was something where they, in fact, stepped in and took over for those kinds of activities. Another category of sports that we see in the neighborhood comes from what's often called sandlot play, where kids from high school and up, young adults, would form into teams, sometimes with a business sponsor, sometimes with a park sponsor, but often it was independent of the park system, and they actually played in places other than in the parks. This happens to be a Langford team from about 1903, and there's a copy of the photograph where the players are identified, and it was an all St. Anthony Park team, which basically meant as far north as the north end of Langford. There weren't a lot of houses farther north than that. So we've got one of the kids from the Herbst family, for instance, in here with this football crowd. But this age group, 14 and up, often ranked by age, sometimes by weight, So it's the 100 to 125 pounder team that's playing other ones in that league. There were teams like this all over the cities. Their activities were reported in the newspapers, in amateur league, and this is a kind of an interesting one. The Historical Society says that it's a St. Anthony Park baseball team from about 1905. It's not. I went checking right away to see where Watson Livery was, the guy standing on the left in the back row. Miriam Park. And Cutter Grocery Company, Miriam Park. And Midway, can't remember what that one was. The names that I could read, or partially read, I looked these up and they're all in Miriam Park. It's a kind of an unusual twist on the sort of sponsorship that these teams would get, which was instead of having one store or company sponsor the whole shebang, it's like each kid was sponsored by one of the local folks. And they played on what were called sand lots rather than on formal fields in the recreation grounds. There was one team around in the 19-teens, I think even into the 20, called the Muldners, Muldners. They were sponsored by a grocery store that had been at the corner of University and Raymond. This is a slightly later map, so the Upham building, this is where Sherritt's is right now, that had been built. It replaced an old house and an old store, frame buildings. They were yellow, like this, as opposed to the brick building. And the owner, Julia Muldner, had moved over here to Cromwell and University. And you can see these open spaces where there are no dark pink or yellow blocks. Those open spaces were empty lots. And that's where teams like the Muldners would play. So their grounds were identified at one point as being at Raymond University. I think they were on that corner, which this block didn't fill up for quite a long time. I think they played right there. And then they were also identified as playing at Cromwell and University. They were managed by one of the team members, somebody who lived on Raymond, worked in one of the companies over by the railroad tracks by the Minnesota Transfer. So it was, there was a lot of flux in them. And now American Legion took over a lot of those teams for quite a long time. Now, I guess we would sometimes call them bar leagues. That's a fairly typical kind of thing. And they play in community parks. All right, now we move to the big places. First, the fairgrounds, where we visited in January. This is the 1885 grandstand at the track. Horses were a huge thing. Here's 1885 again. Lots of people had horses. They used them for transportation. They collected beautiful horses. They took them out and drove on Summit Avenue to show off. They would take them to a driving park. And one of the things that happened here is that they didn't just have the state fair. They had horse races, especially harness racing. And there have been 3 grandstands. This is the second one. I'll show you a better picture of it in a minute. But this was built after the first grandstand. That was 1885. This was built in 1890, and it was the Minnesota Driving Club's clubhouse with lots of balconies and verandas, so the club members could go and they could watch the races from the clubhouse. They got permission to build that building from the state fair, and one of the parts of the deal is that they promised to erect a new grandstand. So here's the clubhouse again, down there with some horses ready for harness racing on the track. And that's the second grandstand from 1892. It was built not by the fairgrounds, not by the state fair, but by the Twin City Jockey Club. Here it is. Pretty spectacular, but like many of these facilities, largely made out of wood and falling apart, rotting. And so there were all kinds of concerns about the fact that it was dangerous and that it shouldn't have all that weight up there on the top, and they needed more space. That was the other thing. So it was eventually taken down. The driving force, no wordplay intended, in that was probably the presence of this local horse named Dan Patch. Dan Patch was a record-breaking, world-famous horse. You see a song that was written for him over on the right, and you can see a picture of him in front of the grandstand that we were just looking at over here on the left. In 2008, there was an article about Dan Patch in Sports Illustrated, and it said that he was, quote, the most celebrated American sports figure in the first decade of the 20th century, as popular in his day as any athlete who has ever lived. So we had a world-famous horse just on the doorstep here. The third grandstand, 1909 and following, was sometimes called the house that Dan Patch built, because there were so many people who were coming in. It's not just the capacity of the grandstand. Even with the second grandstand, they had built way out to the sides all of these extra bleachers in order to be able to watch these races. And here's the backside of the building. Here's the second grandstand, the Jockey Club's grandstand right there. And it wasn't so far from the Livestock Amphitheater, built in 1906. They'd had plans for one of these already back in the 1890s, and neighborhood architect Charles Aldrich was sort of hooked into that job. It was like an enclosed amphitheater. It was open at the top, but then there was seating all the way around, kind of like the Colosseum. I guess that's the best way to describe it. Not the State Fairgrounds Colosseum, the one in Rome, that Colosseum. So that plan fell through, and in 1906 they ended up with the building that you see here, which stood on the site of the current Colosseum. It was enormous. It was pushed very much like by James J. Hill, who had the idea that the Minnesota State Fair was a national deal, and it's how we showed off everything that we had. The building was large enough that it had skylights in it. It was too big to try to light from just around the outside. It was used for lots of events, not just state fair stuff. And starting in 1909, I think it was, they started to use it for skating. It was natural ice, so they opened all the windows and they put the water in and it froze. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner, the largest in the world. It was used by the University of Minnesota hockey team. It was used by the St. Paul Athletics. It was a really, really important space for local hockey. Then it was co-opted for use during the Second World War, and it was a propeller factory, I think, and this is what it looked like when it was a factory. 1942 was when it closed for state fair use, and then I think they tore it down in 1946 because it was, at that time, 40 years old and kind of ruined because of the work that had gone on inside the building. And it was replaced by the Coliseum, which for a long time was called the Hippodrome. I remember, yeah, two of us remember that it was called the Hippodrome, now called the Coliseum, which was itself used for hockey. So starting about 1951, when it was new, there was some hockey use, but especially 1976 until it closed for hockey in 2014. It was used for hockey games. High school, colleges, a couple colleges played here. But more and more there got to be separate arenas, and it's always nice for schools to play on their home turf or near their home turf. And so eventually, partly because the whole process of running the refrigeration units meant they had to be renewing that equipment, meant that it made sense to drop that. Here's something that touches people's hearts these days. University of Minnesota Golf Course, the Les Bolstad course. Started out in 1915 as a 9-hole course. Did not belong to the university at that point. Through the 1920s, it was sometimes called the Twin City course or the Mini Paw Country Club, because it's halfway between the cities. And then in 1929, the U took it over. It was turned into an 18-hole course by the same guy who designed the Midland Hills course, as a matter of fact. 1930, William Ingeman, who built some houses in the University Grove, was tapped to design the clubhouse. So old and newer. And you can't mention the University Golf Course without seeing this picture of the women golfers in the M configuration. Just nearby, one of the latest additions, 1999. This is the women's soccer stadium. This was built with money in honor of Elizabeth Robbie, who had some Twin Cities connections, and in particular, she was the first woman to own a professional sports franchise in the US. She owned the Miami Toros, which became, I think in 1984, 1985, somewhere around there, the Minnesota Strikers. So she had other Twin Cities connections as well, but the soccer stadium is named in her honor. All right, we're going to wrap up with there's another picture of it. 1,000 people or so capacity. All right, now we'll wrap up with the almost, but not quite, This is Greater Northrop Field. The building that you see there is the Armory on the Minneapolis campus. This is where the University of Minnesota Football Club played, and this is the large and improved field. They had one that was smaller, too small. It didn't have fences around it. These clubs, this is always a sports facilities problem. They might be really proud of the fact that the students painted the fences and did all that kind of thing, but they would travel to another school in the Big Ten and they'd see the fabulous stadium they had and they'd come home to this field with bleachers around it and say, oh, we really need something better. Well, after the First World War, they decided that they would raise money for a memorial stadium for the World War I dead. And then they had to decide where they were going to put it. They had two spots just within shouting distance in mind. One was what they called the Hunter property, right here. So Larpenteur is up there. This is Hoyt, right there. Here's Dudley, right along there. So they were going to build this in the Grove, essentially. They were going to build Memorial Stadium in the Grove. And to the north, they probably planned to use that whole area. So that was under serious discussion, although they noted that the terrain was a little bit problematic and they'd have to do a lot of work to level out the hills and make that happen. The other place that they looked at seriously, they had 4 sites, and 2 of the 4 were here. They were looking at Cleveland, Raymond, Como, this corner, where Commonwealth Terrace is now. So it was their property, and that was always a plus when they owned the land. This also had some problems with terrain, most notably Lake Sarita. But those were the 2 spots that they considered, but too far away from the Minneapolis campus and some issues with the ground and the land, and so they decided that they would not build over here in the lagoon. Probably a good idea. Their other 2 sites were closer to Minneapolis. One was on the flats, on the river flats. That would have been quite interesting. And the other was fairly close to Greater Northrop Field, where they built Memorial Stadium. But that was a close call, we might say. And you can imagine what it would be like to have Memorial Stadium and what the campus would be like and all the rest now 100 years later from that proposal. Then we have this set of proposals. This is Lexington Park at the southwest corner of Lexington and University, built in 1897, used by the St. Paul Saints pretty much continuously until 1956. By 1956, there were all kinds of things going on. It was old. That was one problem. Even with a fire in the 19-teens where it all burned down and they rebuilt it, it was still pretty old. There was also a move going on across the country to try to get a Major League Baseball team into cities that didn't have them. And there were 2 things that could happen. You could either get an expansion team, or you could get some existing team to move from, say, Washington, D.C., as what eventually happened for the Twins, to another place. And of course, part of the enticement was, we'll give you a new stadium. Because the Washington Senators, for instance, were an inner-city transit-based team in a very old, like early 20th century ballpark, there was no way that they were going to move into another inner-city transit-based early 20th century ballpark. And so everybody starts building ballparks. And the situation was complicated in the Twin Cities because there were 2 franchises, both top-level minor league teams for major league teams. So the Brooklyn Dodgers had the association with the St. Paul Club, and the New York Giants with the Minneapolis Millers. That's why Willie Mays played here for 3 weeks, till they needed him in New York. And the Giants took out a full-page ad in the Minneapolis papers apologizing for taking Willie Mays away after his very short sojourn. Okay, here's the complicating factor. There was no way there would be 2 major league teams in the Twin Cities. So they figured the territorial rights would be bought out and united, and then they had to have a place. So there were 2 solutions. One of them was in Bloomington, where Metropolitan Stadium was built, and the other one was in the Midway. And this is from the arguments that were made for Midway Stadium. It's Midway, sort of like the State Fairgrounds arguments. And how many people live within certain rings here, and that's what makes the most sense. So where in the Midway? Well, one of the sites that they wanted to build on was Como, Raymond, Cleveland, where Commonwealth Terrace is. So imagine yourself a major league ballpark sitting where the Commonwealth Terrace buildings are. That would have changed the neighborhood just a bit. Here's what they actually built. It's now right, Energy Park Drive goes right through it. Snelling is there across the top of the slide. So on the east side of Snelling, this is the Great Northern Tracks. Northern Pacific Tracks are off to the bottom, to the right. This was the St. Paul solution. The St. Paul Saints moved from Lexington Park here, and they played here for a while until the Twins came in 1961. The Senators came in 1961, bought the territorial rights from both Minneapolis and St. Paul. This was, you look at it and you go, well, why would a major league team play here? This was designed to be expanded. So the seating would go all the way around and up 3 decks. So it was modern, lots of parking. This was one of the sites they came up with. They were looking at something in Como Park, and it came down to this or the spot where the State Fair parking lots are across Como from the Coliseum. That was the other place. And the State Fair didn't want anything to do with it. So it got booted out of that and built there. It was used, by the way, as a municipal stadium. Some of us had driver's ed in the parking lot. I don't know if I'm the only one. But that was one of the things that the city used it for. The Vikings did their preseason training at Midway Stadium. So they came back, they got kind of close there. Then it was torn down when Energy Park was developed, and the second Midway Stadium, half the size, was built on the west side of Snelling, and I think within the old 1873 boundaries of St. Anthony Park. So this is where the current St. Paul Saints were born, and all the zaniness that they became known for happened here. Ooh, kind of blurry, but it's okay. Met Stadium. And we're moving on to our last almost but not facility. Met Stadium was the Minneapolis solution. Yes, I know it's in Bloomington, but it was a collaborative process of with Minneapolis, Richfield, and Bloomington. To get this big modern stadium, it was built with the Millers as the first tenants, and then this was the place that was chosen for the Twins to set up shop. So it's a 1950s building that had a number of expansions, including the kind of difficult multi-sport transition. It was built as a baseball park, but the Vikings showed up in the same year that the Senators / Twins did. And so they added extra stands, and it was always that the football team was playing in a baseball park. The Vikings came into some ascendancy after that point. By the 1970s, they were saying, hey, we need something better, new, football-oriented. And so they started to think about renovating this, because the Met Center was nearby. Kind of a sports district was the way they thought of it. But then they started to think about what the stadium might look like and where it might be located. And I believe there were 7 site proposals, 2 of which were essentially in St. Anthony Park. So here's a view of it. They were both to the west of 280, but not very far west of 280. And it's St. Anthony Park, so you shouldn't be too surprised to learn. Here we are, 5 and 3. I think that's us. Or maybe it was 3 and 7 that were us. Maybe they didn't have the 4th one in here yet, because there was one, and then there was another one that was close, but not quite on the same site. There were meetings, lots of meetings in St. Anthony Park. 1977 is when this happened. And the basic message that they got from the neighborhood was, not in my backyard. Parking, traffic, all these reasons that they gave. There were other things that were being determined, not just the site. Basically, they were looking at downtown or somewhere not downtown. They also, for instance, were looking at things like domed or not domed. And so the end result was the Metrodome, which opened in 1982, but might maybe have been in our spot. The next stadium, of course, was US Bank Stadium, where these guys still play. I promised you that they'd come back again. So here's US Bank Stadium. Its predecessor, its grandparent stadium might well have been a sports space in St. Anthony Park. Any questions? Yeah. Should see if I can get to it. A roller rink next to Lexington Park, and the Luther League would go there. They sometimes called that, there it was. Here it is. That was sometimes called the Coliseum, and they flooded it in the winter, and it was one of the places that the hockey teams would play. So there were a bunch of different spots. Early on, when roller skating was really important in the 1880s, it was a craze, and then it sort of fell out of use, and a bunch of those were turned over to be ice skating and ice polo is what they played at that time. But yeah, that was a really important kind of dance hall, roller rink, hockey rink altogether. Yep. Anything else? Yeah. Sure. Mhm. The church league, we're talking about the church league. Cager Nation, nice. Okay. Here we are. Cager Nation. Okay, so this is a basketball league that started out at College Park. All right, they play on Wednesday nights in Murray Middle School. Excellent. Mhm. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yes. So the comment was that the parks, 19th century park design had to do with this kind of strolling, and that golf courses have a similar sort of thing. But cemeteries and parks, and then garden suburbs, places like St. Anthony Park, were the three pillars essentially of green space design in the 19th century. And they all have the same kind of sensibility and the same romantic, picturesque landscapes. And yep, so cemeteries, exactly. People would take picnics to cemeteries, they'd go strolling in the cemeteries. And there are still beautiful cemeteries like Lakewood or Oakland where you could easily do that. Yeah. Question was whether there were any real cemeteries in St. Anthony Park, and I don't think so, other than the ones in the front yards. By that point, at Halloween, that happens. By that point, this whole cemetery design thing that was going on at the same time that garden suburbs like St. Anthony Park were being designed, part of the issue about the cemeteries is that they were very aware of health issues, and they wanted to be sure that they weren't getting too many people living and working in downtown, and then the old churchyards around the old churches in downtown, and that was really bad, and they would have to do something about that. And so they tried to put the cemeteries way, way, way far away from the towns. So think how far Lakewood Cemetery is from downtown Minneapolis, like 3 miles. But that was a long way at the time. So they were already cognizant of perceived health issues. What if there's an epidemic that goes through and everybody's being buried up, in the ravine behind Murray? That had just freaked people out by that point. And so they tried to be very deliberate about where they were placing cemeteries in and around and essentially outside of cities. So no, as far as I know, no cemeteries in St. Anthony Park. And if you think about where the closest ones are, Rose Lawn is pretty close. Sunset, lots of people from St. Anthony Park back in the day were buried at Sunset. Those places, Hillside, by the way, was a cemetery that had started out kind of close in northeast Minneapolis, and then they moved everybody out of Beltrami Park into Hillside Cemetery for this whole reason that they didn't want everybody too close. But Roselawn was far away and far out, and their whole group of suburban cemeteries through Roseville. There's a stretch of them along Larpenteur, for instance, out towards Phelan. And those were kind of peripheral, far away places. Mm-hmm. Swimming holes in St. Anthony Park. Well, let's see. No, we want to go this way. They were afraid about the water in Langford Park. Something might go wrong. And in fact, kids would swim, I think until relatively recent times. Some former children in the room may be among them, at Lake Sarita. And there was a kid in 1912 who drowned at Lake Sarita. So I think, trying to get there. It's coming. There it is. This lagoon had been co-opted by the State Fair. They had a gondola ride for a while that failed. They let it go. But there was a kid who drowned here in 1912, I think, and there were two professors, a dean and a professor from the university, who happened to come along and tried to save the kid, and one of them couldn't swim, and so they also almost lost one of those two adults who tried to help out. So I think this is the only nearby open water, and I would guess discouraged. Yes? Anybody know? Anybody do any secret swimming in these spaces that they're willing to admit to? So we have somebody who fell in to swamp. That's, yeah. Wearing waders for a class at the U and fell in. It's not quite a swimming hole situation, but yeah. I think Como's probably the closest lake, and I think Johanna, Owasso, they developed beaches, and so I think that's where people went typically. Anything else? Okay, thanks for coming tonight.